Greetings and welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here with us. I'm Amy Antonucci. I am a New Hampshire Peace Action board member, and I want to welcome you to Israel, Palestine, and the Basics of International Law with Mike Merryman-Lotze. This is a special program co-sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee of New Hampshire and New Hampshire Peace Action. And let's actually start the program by just taking a moment to acknowledge that, at least for those of us in New Hampshire, we are doing our work on Idakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land, the waterways, and those people who have been in relationship throughout the generations. All right, a quick reminder on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you have your video on, but do ask that you keep your audio muted and use the chat to ask questions. In fact, you're locked into mute for the moment, and later when we get to hand raising, I'll be able to help you unmute individually. I do want to mention that tonight's topic can bring up a lot of really strong feelings for people. And we just ask that you treat each other with dignity and respect. We want you all to be engaged and to be heard, but we also have a commitment to protecting everyone in this space. So we will mute or even remove folks who are behaving in a way that makes others not feel safe. Okay, so why tonight's program? I wanted to say a little tiny bit about that. So personally, I've had to do a lot of research lately just to feel like I could speak intelligently with and sometimes challenge my representatives and others on even like the meaning of words like occupation, right to self-defense, human shields. And what made me especially interested in what we've put together here was that someone forwarded me an email from a West Virginia Senate candidate, Zach Shrewsbury, and he had defined a bunch of definitions in there, and I realized I was wrong about some of them. So that's when I thought we really need something that just goes over some basics, just helps us to grasp this, vast amount of material. Just the little bit that we can really use right now. And Mike Merryman-Lotze has been gracious enough to join us for that. He serves as the American Friends Service Committee's Just Peace Global Policy Director, leading global peace building work, supporting both U.S. and international staff and programs. He also worked for the AFSC for 13 years, coordinating the Israel-Palestine and Middle East policy and advocacy work. Before being a part of AFSC, he worked as a researcher with the Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq, in the West Bank. He worked in Save the Children's UK's Jerusalem office, and he managed programs for Partners Global throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Mike is going to speak to us, and then we'll move to Q&A. You can put things in the chat, before we get there, and then later we'll do the hand raising. So please join me. Visible would be nice. Welcome for Mike.
Thank you, Amy and Doreen. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming tonight and for spending this time with me. So, as we said, I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues and terms and understandings around Israel-Palestine, but I figured that I would do that kind of by moving sequentially through some different time periods, really starting around 2005 and focusing on Gaza and the Israeli redeployment of its forces at that point, with the impacts that had up to the present and talk about some of the different terms within the context of what's happening. Uh, but before doing that, really just want to also acknowledge the moment that we're in Palestine and Israel, following the Hamas attack on October 7th. The Israeli attacks into Gaza have killed now at least 30,000 people, and there's another 10,000 who are estimated to have who are missing and presumed to be dead underneath the rubble of their homes. Over 65,000 people have been injured. Um, and that's near 5% of the total population of Gaza that's been killed or injured over the last 4 months. I think was reading today that the only comparable rate of death within a conflict was the Rwanda genocide in the 90s. In addition, over 70% of all homes have been destroyed or damaged in Gaza. 85 to 90% of the population has been displaced, including AFSC's staff and partners who are all in Rafah, which now is under threat of again attack and displacement. Starvation and hunger have set in. People are dying from a lack of food and water and medical care. And so at a minimum, what we are calling for is a ceasefire and for uninterrupted humanitarian access to end the immediacy of this crisis, and just want to center things in that call, and we'll get into that a little bit more, and happy to talk with it about the current situation more. But before going there, I really wanted to step back a little bit and just say, the situation in Palestine and Israel, that term that Amy talked about, occupation, is really what defines the situation in Israel and Palestine. So when Israel took over or captured the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in 1967 during the war, and then took control of those areas under international humanitarian law, the laws of war, which bans the acquisition of territory through the use of military force. Those areas that Israel took over then were considered militarily occupied. And so the ruling body of law for those areas, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, became international humanitarian law, and most importantly, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is a piece of law that was drawn up in the wake of World War II. There are 4 Geneva Conventions that deal with both the laws of war, how armies should prosecute war, what's legal and what's illegal during wars, but also when a territory is taken over during the course of a conflict. In the Fourth Geneva Convention, what are the rights and protections of those people as they live under military occupation? And then also, what are the responsibilities of the occupying power, in this case Israel, towards the people who live under its control? And the Geneva Conventions are what are considered customary international law. That means that they've been ratified by enough countries and accepted by the international community to a point where it doesn't matter whether or not a state has signed on to those particular treaties. They are binding on all states and all parties, and the protections that are afforded by the Geneva Conventions are considered binding. And so, some of the basics of what that involves is that an occupying party, in this case Israel, first of all, it can't acquire sovereignty over territory because it's taken it over or controls it after a conflict. Occupation by its nature is supposed to be temporary, and the rights of the occupants may be limited to a certain extent, but not permanently. And actually, right now, over the last few days and continuing, the International Court of Justice is taking on and considering the question of the legality of Israel's occupation, because it's been continuing on for decades, and in many ways violates the principles that were laid out in international humanitarian law because of its length and duration. And so those conversations are being live streamed and to a certain extent covered. and there's a debate about many of these things. But the occupying power is supposed to respect the laws that are in place in the location that it took over, and can't take measures to permanently change that situation. It's banned for an occupying power to move its civilian population into an area where it's occupied, and so that's the illegality of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is a part of that. The occupying power can't extract and take use of the natural resources of the area that it's occupied. It can't transfer the civilian population in the area that it's occupied. Collective punishment is prohibited, and reprisals against the people in the occupied territory or destruction of their property is also banned. Overall, the power that is occupied a territory has a responsibility to the people who it's occupying, and to ensure their safety, their well-being, and the provision of that they have access to basic goods and resources. Those are responsibilities that fall on Israel in this instance. With the peace process, there were some limited authorities designated or given to the Palestinian Authority. So it took control over limited parts of the West Bank, over certain aspects of the education system, over giving some building permits in the small portions of the West Bank that are under its control, but still overall responsibility rested with Israel. So one of the questions in the case of Gaza that comes up, well, what's the status of Gaza after 2005, when Israel took out the settlers from Gaza and redeployed its military forces outside of the borders of Gaza? The general consensus of the international community, and that includes the United Nations, the Red Cross, and the United States, is that Gaza after 2005 remained occupied by Israel. Well, the moving of the 8,000 settlers who were there and who had, prior to their withdrawal, controlled 30% of the land of Gaza was important. Overall, Israel maintained absolute control over Gaza, despite moving its forces outside of Gaza itself. And the measure of whether an area is considered occupied is not so much where troops are present, but what is called effective control. What is the control of an occupying power over that location? And in the case of Gaza, even after it moved its troops after 2005, Israel maintained control over the water, the electricity, the borders, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the currency, the tax revenue, the import and export of goods, the movement of people, and even the population registry, which means that if you were born and die in Gaza, your birth and your death are not official until they're registered with a database maintained by the Israeli authorities. And that's been the case even after 2005 and continuing under Hamas. And that's also why, in many ways, there's often now this question about, are the Hamas Ministry of Health statistics reliable in this current situation? And they are. And one of the reasons for that is that the Ministry of Health is the body that has to transfer all of the information on births and deaths to the Israeli authorities for keeping in that database system. And that's what gives people their identity cards and the documents that allow them to travel. And so it's absolutely vital that that information that comes from them is accurate and is maintained. Another question that comes up during the conversation about 2005 is, well, what about the responsibility of Egypt? If Israel pulled out and Gaza shares a border with Egypt, shouldn't Egypt be able to open up its borders to Palestinians in Gaza? In 2005, as a part of that withdrawal, Israel and Egypt drew up a addendum to the 1979 Camp David Accords, which was an agreement on movement and access that was also negotiated with the Palestinian Authority. And Egypt was then allowed to place 750 new border troops along the border between Egypt and Gaza to ensure that there was no smuggling and no illegal travel outside of Gaza. But the ultimate decision on who could leave Gaza was left in the hands of the Israeli authorities. The Palestinian Authority had to coordinate with the Israeli authorities, and then international observers were placed in Rafah at the border crossing with Egypt to ensure that the Palestinian Authority was coordinating with the Israelis, and so that no person could go out of Gaza without the authority of the Israeli government. And the Egyptians were not allowed to allow anybody into Egypt without the authority of and the approval of the Israeli government. And when Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007, none of that situation changed. The agreement that Egypt had remained with the Israeli government, and any opening of its border without the approval of the Israeli government would have been considered and still would be considered a violation of the 1979 Camp David Accords. And so it, in theory, could open its border, but that would be a violation of the peace agreement that it has with Israel to do so. And so when all of those calls on Egypt to open its borders, and in many ways it should, because the blockade of Gaza is immoral and in many ways illegal, and get to that, it's in a bit of a bind because the actual legal responsibility rests with Israel, and its obligations are to maintain its treaty with Israel. And Israel doesn't want it to open its borders as much as it says that it should. It's put the blockade in place for a reason. When we say that Gaza is under blockade, what we're referring to is a decision in 2006 that was made in 2006 after Hamas was elected into the Palestinian Authority. That was made by Israel, by both Israel and the United States and other countries to essentially boycott any contact with the Palestinian Authority at that time when Hamas was involved in that authority. And then after Hamas and Fatah split and Hamas gained took control of Gaza in 2007, to maintain no contact with Hamas authorities. And in Gaza, that meant effectively closing the border of Gaza, limiting the import and export of goods, limiting the movement of people, limiting the amount of electricity and water that were allowed into Gaza, and restricting overall the rights of people there. Under international law and humanitarian law, and again, the Fourth Geneva Convention in particular, collective punishment of a population is illegal. And the blockade has, by, again, the Red Cross and the UN and others, been declared a form of collective punishment against the population of Gaza, and been declared illegal. And the impacts of the blockade really can't be underestimated. The blockade, when I first started working with Save the Children, I was their child rights program director for Palestine in 2007. About a year after the blockade initially went into effect in Gaza, we were seeing anemia and stunting of growth among children. We were seeing then already 70 to 80% of the population dependent on foreign aid for survival, and that's maintained since then. I remember on one of my first trips into Gaza at that time, a sewage dam had collapsed because of a ban on infrastructure parts coming in, and flooded communities, killing several people. The electricity was sporadic and unreliable. And that's a situation that's continued on since 2007 and only gotten worse over the intervening years. And that situation of blockade and limits is important in terms of understanding the context of violence that led to October 7th and what's happened since then. And I'm going to get to kind of both some of the other terms later, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the narratives of violence that are used as we talk about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. As we talk about the blockade in particular, one of the things it said is that the blockade may be a challenge for Palestinians. It may cause problems for them, but it's justified because of the threat of violence and the use of violence from Palestinians in Gaza. It's justified because of rockets. It's justified because of all of those actions. The numbers speak differently. And so I want to talk maybe about a period from 2014 at the end of the military invasion in Gaza, and in that year that killed 3,500 Palestinians, and really early 2018. Immediately after that invasion ended, you had a number of months of no rocket fire from Gaza at all, as the Palestinian parties in Gaza lived into the ceasefire agreement that had been put in place to end that conflict, and the conditions of that were an end to violence on the Palestinian side and an opening and ending of the blockade on the Israeli side, as well as steps towards political resolution. That silence, or that end of rocket fire, wasn't matched by an end of violence from the Israeli military, and that continued over the next years. So that according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz in 2015, there were a total of 21 rockets that were fired from Gaza. In 2016, there were 15 rockets fired from Gaza, and in 2017, 35. Now that's more than there should have been, but primarily those were fired into open areas. They didn't cause death or injury, and they were fired mostly by spoiler groups who were trying to upset the situation. During that same period, 25, 26, and 2016 and 2017, Israel killed 64 Palestinians in Gaza, injured approximately 3,000, and carried out attacks nearly every day. Just in the period of January to March of 2018, there were 181 times that Israel carried out some kind of military operation in Gaza over that 3-month period. And so as we talk about, and as that went on, despite kind of the Palestinian effectively living into the ceasefire during that period, there was no change in the blockade. There was no change in the rights that Palestinians were given in Gaza. And then in 2018, when the Great March of Return started as a nonviolent protest against the blockade, it was again met with brutal violence, with thousands of Palestinians injured and hundreds killed. And so that comes to the question: well, what about violence in this situation? What's the legal status of that? We hear a lot about kind of the Israeli right to self-defense and the Palestinian right to resist as terms. What do we mean by those things? One, in terms of the Palestinian right to resist, there is, if we're talking about international law, a right given by particularly Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions from 1977, but also several UN General Assembly resolutions, a right of people to struggle for independence and territorial integrity, and to resist foreign domination and foreign occupation, including through use of force. Article 4 of the Additional Protocol of the Geneva Convention classifies conflicts in which people are fighting against alien occupation and racist regimes as armed conflicts, and individuals engaging in such, if captured, should be treated as prisoners of war, meaning that their fighting is legitimate. But that statement that Palestinians have a right to resist doesn't mean that all violence is legitimate or that all violence is right. As the right to resist is given in international law, it's also bounded by international law, which means that the prohibitions on attacks on civilians that you have in any situation of conflict, the need for distinction in terms of targets, all of that applies, and so an act that of violence that attacks a civilian would be considered illegal. But the person who carries out that attack, again, wouldn't necessarily be considered a terrorist as we use those terms, but as a prisoner of war, somebody who's violated the laws of war, and would be treated in many ways, or should be treated in many ways, as the same as an Israeli soldier or somebody else who has also violated the laws of war and who needs to be held accountable for their military actions. The right to self-defense is not grounded in international law, at least for Israel in this situation of military occupation. An occupying power's primary duty is to the people who are living under its control. It is charged with keeping the peace and maintaining order until its occupation ends, but it doesn't have a right then to self-defense against or to claim that its military actions are self-defense against the people who it is maintaining military domination and control over. And any military actions that it takes have to again then be grounded and limited by the laws of war and occupation. Again, it can't engage in collective punishment. It can't engage in reprisals. It can't simply seize or destroy property of the people who are occupied. And people who are accused of criminal offenses, violations of the law, should be given the rights afforded to anybody through a judicial process. And access. So, that's to say that as an organization, AFSC is a pacifist organization, and I personally am somebody who believes in nonviolence and works to end all violence. And yet, at the same time, we live in a world in which war and violence are regulated by laws. And states have claimed for themselves a right to use force and to use military power that's limited by those laws of war. And those people who are living under military occupation also have a right to use force legally, and that's not to speak towards the moral or ethical issues that are involved with use of violence. In somewhere like Gaza right now, as a military as the Israeli military uses force, key factors that are always important in a situation of war are in determining whether an action is legal or lawful, or is the action that the military is taking what's called proportional to the threat that's posed. Is the military making a distinction between those who are either in an opposing military or an armed group and others, is it taking action that's serving a military objective? In the case of Israel, I think what many of us are saying is that its actions are neither proportionate nor are they making any distinction between civilians and military targets. The destruction that we're seeing of infrastructure and homes has surpassed the level of destruction that was caused by the fire bombings of Dresden during World War II. It's an absolutely shocking level of destruction that's occurred in Gaza, and it's completely disproportionate to any of the threats that are posed. Israel, in justifying its use of violence in that way, has said that the reason that it is bombing and destroying homes and hospitals and schools and cultural institutions is that there are tunnels that Hamas is among the population, and that Hamas has used all of these locations and held or placed, and that Palestinians are being used as human shields in that sense. Under international humanitarian law, a human shield is a civilian placed in front of a military objective so that his civilian status will deter the enemy from attacking that objective. It's a civilian who's purposely placed there and strategically placed there. And the use of human shields is absolutely forbidden in all instances. One of the more important points about Israel's claims to Palestinians being used as human shields is that, one, it's a claim that's not been backed up by any evidence at all. That while there is a claim that Palestinians are that every home, every hospital, every school is placed over a tunnel, that fighters are among the population. There is an obligation of Israel to prove that that's true, and that has not been proven. In fact, in nearly every instance in the past, it's been disproven. Those claims were made also in 2008 and 2009 and 2012 and 2014 during the past attacks on Gaza, and the investigations by the United Nations, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch found in almost all instances that there was no evidence that the claims being made by Israel for the placement of weapons in protected spaces like hospitals, schools, and mosques could be was true, and that there was no evidence of the purposeful use of Palestinian civilians as human shields. You know, and yes, Hamas is mixed in to the Palestinian population in Gaza. That can't be a surprise in one of the locations that is perhaps the most densely populated place in the world. But that does not resolve Israel or absolve Israel of its responsibility to take care for that population, to ensure that they are protected as it carries out its military actions. You know, the presence of armed groups among a civilian population, particularly in situations of military occupation, is normal. We saw that. You would see that with partisans during World War II. You would have seen that in Algeria during the time of struggles against the colonial rule there. And you'll see it around the world in conflicts where an irregular force is fighting against or in conflict with a military power. That doesn't absolve the military power of responsibility for ensuring the protection of a civilian population. It doesn't absolve Hamas either of needing to ensure that its actions aren't placing civilians at harm or at risk. But overall, the level of force and the level of violence coming from the Israeli authorities is such that its actions can't be considered proportionate to the threat that's being posed. There's a question about the term genocide and how that's being used and why that's being used in this situation as well. And that again has to do with both the level of violence in and killing, but also the statements made by Israeli officials about what their intentions are in this situation. Genocide again is a legal term. There's the Convention on the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and it defines genocide as being made up of two elements. One is a physical element, the acts are, and the other is mental or the intent. To constitute a genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of a perpetrator to physically destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in part or in whole. This doesn't mean that the whole group needs to be destroyed, but that the actions are such that they can be inferred to be taken for the purpose of destroying the people or making life for them impossible. And what we've seen in Gaza over the last 4 months, many of us will say uh, amounts to an act of genocide, with 5% of the population dead or missing over a 4-month period, with the level of destruction that's been taken, but also because of the statements that have been made by Israeli officials, calling for the mass destruction of Gaza, the wiping out of the people, saying that there are no civilians, that there are no innocents, that children can be killed, using language that justifies and calls for ethnic cleansing of the population in a way that led also the International Court of Justice then last month to conclude that it is plausible to say that a genocide may be occurring. And one of the important things about that is that a genocide, whether or not it is actually occurring or not, implies an obligation or obligates the international community to act. It's considered the worst war crime that could happen, and there is a responsibility of the international community under international law to prevent a genocide from occurring, and that means that states should, even if they suspect a genocide may be at risk, should take actions to demand a ceasefire in that situation, impose arms embargoes, and take other actions to end the conflict so as to respect the rights of people. Before I close and kind of open for conversation, I also want to deal lastly with the term apartheid. And that is because he started out by speaking about the situation in Palestine as one defined by occupation and by the Geneva Conventions. But the occupation started in 1967 and has shifted and changed over those years. And for AFSC, but also for many both Israeli and international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Israeli organizations B'Tselem and Yesh Din, and of course Palestinian civil society, the situation in Israel and Palestine is one that we've defined as apartheid. And apartheid, again, is not simply a term that's being borrowed from South Africa because of its emotional resonance. Apartheid is a legal definition or a legal term. As the anti-apartheid movement moved forward, there was a recognition that apartheid and the situation of racial and ethnic inequality and injustice that it entailed was not unique to the South Africa context, that Jim Crow laws in the US could have qualified as a situation of apartheid, that inequality in other situations qualified as apartheid. And so to that end, in 1973, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid was ratified, and in 1990 1948, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court also integrated in a definition of apartheid. And so apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity that involves inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group or person over any other racial group or person and systematically oppressing them. These inhumane acts include murder, torture, arbitrary arrest, legislative discrimination measures, the persecution of people resisting apartheid, and more. And in the context of Israel and Palestine, what we say is that the situation there qualifies, and that's important for understanding not only what's happening in the West Bank, which many of us are more familiar with, but also the realities of Gaza and inside the borders of Israel itself, where there is the regular denial of two people of life, liberty, and independence, where torture and cruel, inhumane treatment is a part of the military detention system. Arbitrary arrest and illegal detention are regular parts of life. That denial of access to the basic conditions that allow for dignified life are denied to people, including access to water and electricity, freedom of movement, freedom to access religious institutions, freedom to move for the purpose of education, limitations on expression, on opinion, on political rights, separation of families, expropriation of land, and more. And so, as we speak about what's happening and consider the situation in Gaza, it's important to put it into that context overall of apartheid and moving away. Not wanting to leave us on a on just a negative note, and maybe saying a little bit about outside of the legal definitions what can be done, and how we can push for something that's different. I think there was just a UN interagency standing committee that today issued a list of 10 actions that it thinks are necessary to bring change, particularly in Gaza. And so I'll read those and then we can open up. The first of those is an immediate ceasefire. And then second, civilians and the infrastructure they rely on need to be protected. Third, hostages to be released immediately. Fourth, reliable entry points that would allow for the bringing of aid at all possible crossings, including northern Gaza. Security assurances and unimpeded passage to distribute aid at scales across Gaza with no delays, denials, or access impediments. A functioning humanitarian notification system that allows all humanitarian staff and supplies to move within Gaza and deliver aid safely. Roads to be passable and neighborhoods to be cleared of explosive ordinances. A stable communication network that allows humanitarians to move safely and securely. UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian operations in Gaza, to receive the resources it needs to provide life-saving assistance. And finally, a halt to campaigns that seek to discredit the United Nations and non-governmental organizations doing their best to save lives. So those were listed as criteria. And as we continue to reach out to our political leaders and push for change, and hoping that those are some of the things that we can be asking for.
Thank you, Mike. Wow. Why don't you take a breath? I'm going to say a few things, and then we'll get to questions. First, I want to make sure it's clear to people. Many of our programs go until 8. This one is going until 8:30. So don't, we have time for your questions. Don't worry about that. Yeah. The other thing I actually would like to say, and you spoke to this as well, Mike, tonight we're talking about legal systems and what's legal, not so much what's moral. And honestly, it's uncomfortable to me, maybe to a lot of you. And just want to acknowledge that just because something is legal, we're not saying it's right, okay? The purpose again of tonight is really to wrap our minds around some of this law because it's coming up so much in our conversations with people, and having some specifics and some information to talk with them about has been helpful. I wish we could win over our representatives on purely moral grounds. That is not working, not to say that they seem to be listening about legal grounds either, but we're trying to kind of meet people, speak to, at least when they tell us these things that are wrong, we can call them on it. The other thing on that I want to say, yeah, I mean, for instance, okay, the weird moment that we're in, that frankly we're always in to some extent as peace activists. We've been calling on folks to ask their senators to support the Van Hollen amendment. People, you know this, where most of us are horrified that what we want is for the supplemental not to go through, and we find ourselves asking for this tiny little thing. So, I'm trying to acknowledge the kind of contradictions and weirdnesses that come up here. That said, again, we really appreciate, Mike, you're bringing us this information, which is powerful for us to have. I do want to take questions, and I do want to remind people that, we want to try to be respectful, treat each other well, speak of people with dignity. I know everyone here has very strong feelings. I think there'd be something wrong with us if we didn't have very strong feelings. We're still going to practice in this space, bringing respect to our words. And with that, I would love to have, I see there's a lot of comments in the chat. We like starting with questions since we have someone here to answer them. I'll look again in the chat, but also you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Yeah, and Moji, I'm going to let you go first while I look at the chat. Did that work? Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Sister Amy, and thank you, Brother Mike. I am an Iranian-American Sufi monk, peace and justice and human rights and Mother Earth activist, civility activist. And being from Iran, I have seen the horrors when an ideology uses religion to justify its atrocities. So the moral aspect that Sister Amy referred to, I like your comment about. And the moral aspect is something that I am, I was part of Occupy as well as Standing Rock uprisings. And the moral part includes the injury that is being done to those Israelis that are brainwashed into believing that their safety is at the expense of the genocide in Gaza. And they are being harmed in the same way that the whites in South Africa, as well as in this country, in the genocide of Native Americans, have been deeply harmed. So I wrote an op-ed with a Jewish brother who happens to be gay, a Jewish op-ed, a Muslim Jewish op-ed, to say never again is a red line and therefore not vote for Biden. if you're interested, if you give me your email, I'll send you my op-ed, which hasn't been so far published anywhere for obvious reasons. But it's a response to the Tom Friedman's insects op-ed of February 2nd in the so-called newspaper of the record, the New York Times, which is mass dehumanization. So comment, please, and if you're interested, I can send you some more information about what I'm doing and the op-ed also. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to see the article. I mean, I think, I've spent now I think my first trip to Palestine and Israel was 28 years ago, which is hard to believe. And have spent a long time engaged there and living in 7 years living there and then regular time back and forth and working both with Israeli and Palestinian partners. And I lived in the West Bank throughout the Second Intifada period, which was an incredibly violent period of time in which we all witnessed a lot of violence impacting, for myself, people on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians. And you see the psychological impact and the psychic impact that has on people and on society, the way in which it damages people. And at AFSC, it's one of the reasons that we have both an Israeli program that supports, kind of those on the radical left within Israel who are working for change and to counter militarization within society there, and a Palestine youth program that works with young adults and in envisioning what a different future might look like, and pulling people together to work on those aspects of things. And so, while I'm speaking about kind of some of the legal issues here, absolutely see it as important to work with people to address the roots of conflict and the impact that it has on society and themselves. It was one of the reasons actually I moved away from where I started on the human rights side of things, because human rights is very much grounded in technical legal frameworks, without kind of addressing the human aspects of and impact of conflict and violence.
Thanks.
Thank you. I sent you my email in
Okay.
private message. Thank you.
And I was going to ask Evelyn's question, but Evelyn has raised her hand, so why don't I go ahead and pass it to you. Evelyn? She's working on unmuting, I can tell. There she goes.
Thank you. We have all these beautiful international laws, but who can enforce them and how? It looks like even the ICJ decision, not many people do something about it, and it's certainly not obeyed by Israel.
Yeah. No, it's one of the challenges of international law. So there are two different parts of international law. There's human rights law and international humanitarian law. And I've mostly spoken about international humanitarian law, which are the laws of war. And those in theory should be enforced by the states that have signed on to the treaties involved. So the states parties to the Geneva Convention, that's the US and European countries, when they see violations, grave violations, have an obligation to act to stop those violations and to hold accountable those who violated the law. As with the ICJ, it's very hard to get cases before it, and while it's said that a genocide may be occurring, for it to actually hold people accountable and then to move towards actual criminal liability and responsibility may take several years. So, international humanitarian and human rights law are not pieces of law that are are easy to enforce and aren't necessarily the mechanisms that we want to turn to as the tools that we use to push for change. That's still really reliant, I think, if we want to hold people accountable, on pushing for action by our political leaders and others who can enforce political costs on those with power to enforce change. But as we deal with our political leaders, they're going to be working within the frameworks of the laws and will only be responsive to things that they say are violations of legal obligations, and are more responsive to those things than to appeals to conscience oftentimes. And so that's one of the important points in why it's good to understand it, is that when you speak to those with authority, they're often wanting you to ground what you're saying within legal obligations, as unsatisfactory as that is for actually realizing change, which I would say comes much more from people power.
Thanks, Mike. Interesting answer. That's a good reminder. Okay. Let's see. Let me ask some other ones that have come up in the chat. Yeah, let's do this one. Sarah asks, is the statement by Netanyahu that he cannot accept a Palestinian state next to Israel this tantamount to declaring a permanent occupation? And are there legal consequences of putting that out there?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the discussion around apartheid, and part of what pushed Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to move towards acceptance of an apartheid frame. They had been reluctant. I mean, Palestinians have been pushing for use of the term apartheid for 20 years, and the international community, human rights organizations, resisted it. But as they saw occupation moving from what they saw as temporary to something that was permanent, because of the actions that Israel was taking on the ground in terms of seizing of territory and imposition of settlements, then they moved to that framework. And what I would say is that Netanyahu, to be honest, has been saying that for decades. It's not a hidden thing. He's just been more explicit about it in the last months, and not saying it primarily to an Israeli audience. So I think that the statement that there can't be a Palestinian state next door, really what it begs is the question of then, if there is no Palestinian state, what do you do with the Palestinians who are living under Israeli control? And if you are not giving them rights within the state or the area that you control, and are maintaining them as a secondary or second-class citizens with limited rights, then that is unquestionably a situation of apartheid, and one then that the international community must oppose.
Thank you. And actually, I know a lot of groups that have been calling for human rights for all rather than a two-state solution for many, many years. A lot of Palestinian groups as well. It's clear, though, that what's happening now, there could be various ways out of this, but what's happening now is not okay. George, is that your hand? You're not using the, yeah, okay, go ahead. George, remember to unmute. Yeah, there you go.
How do you conceptualize what happens even within Israel, Arab citizens in Israel, because they also are subject to very different laws, what they can, where they can live,
Yeah.
who they can marry, a lot of different things. So how do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, at AFSC, when we accepted an apartheid framework, we didn't draw a boundary at the green line, and so we say that that's a system of discrimination that exists regardless of location in all of historic Palestine, including in, the areas that are considered Israel proper, that, the discrimination that Palestinian citizens of Israel face are different from those that are faced by Palestinians in the West Bank, but the discrimination that Palestinians in the West Bank face are different than the discrimination faced by Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and that's different than what's faced by Palestinians in Gaza. But overall, in all locations, there is systematic discrimination against the Palestinian population, instituted through laws, and that the situation of apartheid is not limited just to the occupied Palestinian territories.
I wonder how many Americans even know that. Because to me, that's quite striking. I mean, I knew that, but it's striking just how stratified it is. And I'll stop talking but it is striking to me just how stratified it is.
Yeah, and I would really recommend it. I mean, if people are interested in that topic in particular, the Amnesty International resources that were put together around the issue of apartheid, including some short videos and some online courses that people can take, are really good primers on those issues of discrimination, and how they're faced.
Great. I have a couple more questions from the chat I'd like to put out there. So the destruction of the hospitals.
Yeah.
Someone is wondering, like, if that's not genocide, like that seems very clearly a genocidal intent to destroy hospitals so even people injured cannot be helped, let alone people who have cancer or diabetes or anything like that. Like that just seems so egregious. How does international law, how does that fit in? What does that say?
I mean, hospitals and medical facilities are always considered protected spaces. So in any situation of armed conflict, occupation, or other, hospitals are supposed to be protected spaces. If they are used for military ends, they can lose their protected status. But there really needs to be proof that those institutions and spaces are being used for military purposes. It can't just be a claim that they are. There really has to be, for them to lose their status. In the case of Gaza, nearly every hospital in Gaza now has been attacked and destroyed, one after the other. The excuse in every instance has been that they're somehow Hamas centers, but there's been no proof of that. There's been no evidence of that in any of those instances. And even if there were, there would need to be, even if there were Hamas individuals within the hospitals, there would need to be then a distinction made by the Israeli authorities on what is the cost of destroying this hospital for the civilian population. If you have 5% of the population who've been injured or killed, what does it mean to not have medical infrastructure who can provide aid and assistance to that population? If you have a displaced population living in squalid conditions in tents, what does it mean not to have access to medical care for that population? If you have 50,000 pregnant women, what does it mean to not have medical care for that population? So, all of that means that the responsibility and really proof that it's not violating laws is squarely on Israel's shoulders in this instance, and those are spaces that always should be protected. That in and of itself wouldn't necessarily be enough to prove genocide. That's a really high bar. But taken together with the level of destruction, the statements of intent, and other actions, it would certainly be one of the criteria that would be considered.
Thanks. It's again, it's just heartbreaking that we have to even talk about law. I mean, some of this just seems so horrifying. The fact that anyone would try to justify it is hard to wrap one's mind around here. Okay, here's a question from someone. It seems that part of the relevant international law, it depends on the understanding that Israel is occupying Palestine. But that is often ignored. And the question is, when will we approach lawmakers? This is likely to come up. How can we address this and this discrepancy? And I would like to add with that, one thing that we have been watching in our language lately is the use of the term war, because I don't think that fits or is appropriate here. You're talking about a civilian population against an army. That's not a war. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so the two parts of that. One, I mean, the occupation, the situation of occupation, for us, it's just kind of always saying, yes, this is that the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are militarily occupied. You can say disputed or occupied, but they're still controlled over by Israel, and the people in those areas are systematically denied their rights. So whatever the terminology that somebody is willing to use in terms of what that is, what the situation is, it doesn't end the reality of discrimination and rights violations that are ongoing for Palestinians in those situations. We also don't use the term war to describe the situation in Gaza. You can't, an occupying power can't go to war against the occupied people. A situation of occupation to a certain extent is a situation of unresolved international armed conflict. And as is said in the chat here, a number of parties in the area are using war to describe the situation in Gaza, but there's a difference between legal term war and the rhetorical use of the term to describe the situation and what's happening there. And I think also in this situation, you have to look at the overwhelmingly one-sided nature of the conflict as it's unfolding, and what's happening there, in terms of how violence is being meted out.
Okay. There were some questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you'll have really know about this, Mike, but okay. So there's a little back and forth about whether Hamas or the Houthis are using the term war. I'm not exactly sure that's relevant when we talk to our reps, but do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think there are some questions about whether or not Hamas or other groups abide by international humanitarian law, and whether it's important in that situation. And I would say the answer is that clearly Hamas's actions on October 7th were not in line with humanitarian law or the laws of war. That they were crimes, that the killing of civilians is always wrong. That use of sexual violence or other acts are violations of the law and immoral, and at the same time, nobody is saying that or that those laws are legal. And the international community has placed Hamas under sanction, declared it an illegal organization. Its members can be killed and assassinated with impunity by the international community. Membership in Hamas can have you put in prison. Even for myself, as I do work in Gaza, if I were to offer a Hamas member a cup of coffee, that would be a violation of the law. that would be considered material support for terrorism. There can be no contact with members of those organizations. So there is a sense of legal accountability for those actions that's been demanded and recognized by the international community. And so when we're talking about the need for international law to be respected with Israel, what we're saying is that there needs to be an equal a system of accountability that says that the killing of people who are innocent civilians, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, needs to be condemned on both sides. That that consistently we need to stand on the side of people and their rights, and apply it. That the idea that we're not saying that only one party should live up to international law, but we're saying that only one party is being excused from living into international law. And so that if we're talking about exceptions in this instance, it's Israel that's being exempted from the expectation that it upholds the laws of war. And that's the point. I think that the question in the comments about the rights of LGBTQ people or the rights of women in Islamic countries or any of those rights is a straw man argument. It's hard for me to take seriously a comment that calls out the violations of people in one country. And I will say that the violations of people in any country, their rights are something that we should be working to end. And I've done that in many locations. I was just on the Hill with people from South Sudan and Sudan, and from North Korea and other places, working for rights in those situations, but don't hold up those rights as a way of justifying the violation of Palestinian rights. That's not being consistent or serious about human rights. It's instrumentalizing and using rights to justify abuses, and that's wrong.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let's see. All right, I'm going to call on Hossam. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I think you should be able to unmute now.
So Mike, people who are living outside Gaza are illegal settlers. They are not civilians. They do know they are living on occupied territories. Hence, they are not civilians, innocent civilians. And there is no evidence for women raped in Israel during Hamas attack on October 7th. And the story of 40 beheaded babies are also debunked. There is no such story happened, but there are several evidences that says Palestinian women are subjected to sexual assault in Israeli prison. And some of Gazan women during this war were also kidnapped and experienced sexual assault from Israeli soldiers. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would say two things. One, I would disagree on the statement that there aren't any civilians. I think that we can say that there's a situation of military occupation. We can say that it's a situation rooted in settler colonialism, and and I think we could probably find some places to agree there. But at the same time, and this is a debate that we had along, when I was at Al-Haq around the status of settlers and who've been moved in and are armed and what their status is. But overall, I think that we need to recognize that there are people who are civilians and who are not armed. And if you're going to ask for the protection of civilians in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, we also have to extend that same protection to Israeli civilians. But would agree that there was a lot of misinformation that's been used that came out about what happened on September 11th. Yes, I mean, it was claimed that there were babies that were beheaded and there were 40 babies killed and others, and it turns out that there was one infant killed during that attack. That many of the allegations of sexual violence were made by the same individuals who made other claims that have been disproved, and so it's unclear what the status of those things are. At the same time, I'm not going to say that I can absolutely say that there wasn't sexual violence, as we've seen, occurs in many instances of conflict. Not that it was maybe as systematic as we say. I don't think that that's to demonize, as was said. There have been instances of sexual violence against Palestinians that have been alleged, as well as instances of rape of female soldiers by other soldiers within the Israeli military in a situation of conflict. Unfortunately, whether it's there or Iraq or the U.S. military or anywhere else, sexual violence is quite common and something that needs to be taken seriously, but it also shouldn't be used to dehumanize and to excuse abuses in the way that many of the stories have been used.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask you this one because it's very relevant right now. The UN agency responsible for humanitarian assistance in Gaza has been accused of aiding Hamas. The organization has said, it acted against anyone who may have, I'm going to say may have aided, because I've never seen any actual evidence that it's true. However, they did respond. So what's the current situation for UN humanitarian work?
Yeah. I was on a phone call. That's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And so actually, AFSC, where I work, was asked by the United Nations to set up the refugee camp system in Gaza in 1948. And we did that, and then turned over responsibility for those camps to UNRWA in 1950. And so we've had a long history of engagement with UNRWA. UNRWA is the party responsible for providing assistance and overseeing the care for the Palestinian refugee population, not only in Gaza but also in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and throughout the Middle East. UNRWA employs approximately 30,000 employees throughout all of the Middle East. It employs about 13,000 people in Gaza. In Gaza, 70% of the population are refugees, descendants of people who were displaced in 1948 from their homes. And UNRWA is the largest service provider of humanitarian assistance throughout the region, and particularly in Gaza right now. It not only has those 13,000 employees, it runs the schools, it runs distribution centers and facilities, health clinics, and is the location where a lot of people are sheltering. AFSC is providing assistance in Gaza, and we're doing that in part because of we have been granted some space at a UN compound where we're able to send emails and coordinate some of our own distribution of aid in Gaza. The percentage of refugees was 70% of the population in Gaza. But the UNRWA, so the allegations made by Israel were that 12 employees of UNRWA had participated possibly in the attack on October 7. Of those 12, 2 were dead, 1 UNRWA could not identify, and 9 others were immediately suspended when those allegations were made from their employment. These were lower level employees, 12 out of 13,000, not people in decision-making authority. And most importantly, at least when I had talked with UNRWA last week, they had not received any written information from the Israeli authorities outlining what the allegations against those people were. So they were allegations that were made, but without evidence provided to UNRWA. The action by UNRWA was them taking seriously those allegations and saying that it was a violation of their principles. Regardless, the US and other international actors immediately moved to cut off all funding to UNRWA. That's been a long-term goal of the political right and of Israel for many years. They see dismantling UNRWA as a step against Palestinian refugee rights, and a political action that they want to take. And so, this played into that. UNRWA has enough funding right now to continue operating until the end of February. And at the end of February, it's said that without influx of additional funding, it will have to cease operating. And that the impact of that can't be overstated. That will devastate an already horrifying situation. It will end the provision of aid throughout Gaza, and will be really, a tragic situation. I think the other thing that should be concerning, though, is the impact that UNRWA ceasing to operate will have throughout the region. That UNRWA operates camps in Lebanon and provides assistance to a significant population there. It runs camps and works with people in Jordan. The impact won't just be felt in Gaza; it will be felt also in East Jerusalem. It'll be felt in the West Bank and throughout the region, and that's particularly in Lebanon, potentially destabilizing.
Thanks. I have a question about terminology. So we know some folks in the West Bank who have now been picked up and, put in this indefinite detention, which I understand thousands of people are in. And part of what again, the terminology, I don't think they're prisoners. Are they detainees? Are they political prisoners? Are they hostages?
Yeah.
Why aren't they hostages? What's
So the technical term, the legal term in the region is administrative detainees. And that goes actually back to the law that allows or that Israel uses to justify detaining Palestinians without charge or trial, is actually British Mandate era laws that were used to lock up both Jewish and Palestinian activists when the British were in control, and those laws carried over into the Jordanian law, and then into they continued through, and Israel uses them to justify. But basically, the law says that a person can be locked up for up to 6 months without ever being charged or tried on secret evidence, and that order of detention can be renewed indefinitely, so you can be held for years without charge or trial. Administrative detainee is what is used there, but yes, you would consider that person a political prisoner. It would be the equivalent term.
okay? That is something that we'd like to bring to our reps at some point, because a number of them have expressed concern about political prisoners in other places.
One of the important points, though, is that the administrative detainees, those who are held without charge or trial, is a small minority of the total prisoner population. The prisoner population is much larger, and as I think was put here, 7,000 people at least have been detained in that since October 7th, and that doesn't include all of those detained from Gaza, which nobody knows their status or where they are. But the Israeli military court system that is used to detain Palestinians has a 99.7% conviction rate, right? And it is a system where torture, physical and verbal abuse are systematically used against prisoners, both in order to coerce confessions, but also as they're being held. And so it's important to highlight those prisoners who are held in administrative detention because of the lack of charges against them, the lack of trials. But overall, really, almost anybody who's been arrested in that situation is a political prisoner who's been denied due process and justice.
Good point. Thank you. Okay, so we are nearing the end here, folks, and I do have some upcoming events and such to let you know about. So I think we're going to move into that. I you know, we gave this an hour and a half, and I now see it was silly for me to think that was enough time to cover this. This is a huge topic. But I do really hope, and I personally feel that this has given me some more information and some more grounding so that I can, you know, again, continue our advocacy a little bit more, what's the word? Confidently, intelligently, something like that. And I really appreciate that. Mike has put into the chat some resources. I am going to say some of that out loud for those of you watching who can't, or listening who can't see it. afsc.org/topics/Gaza-Israel. I also want you to know that you can learn more and stay connected to the New Hampshire folks, afsc.org/programs/new-Hampshire. And also New Hampshire Peace Action. We are at nhpeaceaction.org. I will put all of that into the chat. Whoops, or will I? Let's see, hopefully that worked. I'm not sure it did. Let me just keep going here. I want to let you know we have a lot of other programs coming up or in the works. I will try to get a link in the chat, but nhpeaceaction.org/events. We're also on Facebook. I have a lot of events listed there. Also note that this program, along with many others that we've done, is available on our YouTube channel. So our New Hampshire Peace Action YouTube. Just note that you have to often go not under videos, but under live, because we are live recording this. So they end up there and they don't let us move them. I'd like to tell you about a few programs coming up. As I said, if you're in New Hampshire, we have some in-person ones. We're doing weekly Ceasefire Now vigils for peace. These call for a permanent ceasefire, an end to the Israeli blockade of Gaza, an end to U.S. military aid to Israel, and a commitment to human rights and peace for everyone in the region. The next ones are Thursday, February 22, that's tomorrow, noon to 1 at the City Plaza in front of the State House in Concord. And Wednesday, February 28th, 2 to 3 will be in Dover at Representative Pappas's office at 660 Central Ave. Our next online peace and justice conversation is Monday, February 26th, 7 to 8 Eastern Time on Zoom. This will be a conversation with Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, who will talk about how Iran figures into this current growing situation, let's call it for now, and why that is important. On Wednesday, February 28th, from 9 to 1, there is going to be an in-person nonviolence training happening in Durham, New Hampshire. So if you are local, contact us and we can get you more information on that. And maybe Maggie will put something in the chat about it. We'll see how that goes. And I'll just also say Thursday, March 7th, 7 to 8:30 will be on Zoom, although you do not have to stay for the whole thing. It's New Hampshire Peace Action and Action Corps are hosting an action night called No Wider War. And we're going to have some conversation about, again, the expanding conflicts and what we might ask of our representatives and how we can have some influence and understanding about what's going on in the larger picture here. So with all that said, I really want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for staying engaged and active. This is a very hard issue, very painful, heartbreaking moment. And we're just pleased, inspired, happy that people want to know more, people want to do something. that fewer people at least, are ignoring this issue. It is past time to do that, and we're really glad to be with you doing so. Mike, thank you so much. And everyone join me in some kind of visible thank you to Mike for the amazing work he's doing and for taking time to come and speak with us tonight. Thank you all.